Welcome to the Classic Soap Operas podcast.
Great to be diving into another fascinating show today.
Absolutely. And today we're taking a deep dive into a show that, well, it really dared to be different. A series that didn't just stick to the usual melodrama. It boldly mixed it with the dark, atmospheric world of Gothic horror.
You got it. We're talking about Dark Shadows, the groundbreaking ABC series that originally ran weekdays from, June 1966 to April 1971.
That's the one. And anyone who watched daytime TV back then, or maybe even discovered it later, knows it was just unlike anything else on the air.
Completely unique.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really explore what made this show such an enduring kind of cult phenomenon. We'll look at its surprising origins, introduce you to its key characters, and that unique, really atmospheric setting of Collinsport and its infamous mansion.
Collinwood.
Right,
Yeah.
Collinwood.
Yeah.
And trace its lasting legacy, pulling out all the fascinating insights from the materials we've got here.
So get ready for a journey filled with vampires, ghosts, werewolves, witches.
And, of course, the deeply complicated lives and, those long-held secrets of the Collins family.
It's quite a universe they built, especially when you think about where it all started, because the starting point for Dark Shadows is almost as mysterious and dramatic as the show itself.
Okay, let's get into this. The genesis of Dark Shadows is really legendary in television history, isn't it?
Yeah.
It all kicked off, quite literally, with a dream.
That's the story. The show's creator, Dan Curtis, known for his work in, Gothic and horror films, he claimed the entire concept came to him in this vivid dream he had one night back in 1965.
A dream. Seriously.
Yeah. In the dream, he saw this mysterious young woman on a train. She was heading towards this large, kind of brooding house perched on a hill overlooking the sea.
Wow. Just that image. A woman, a train, spooky house.
Pretty much. A seemingly simple, almost Gothic romance kind of image. But he took this striking visual, this vague idea of mystery and a house, and he actually pitched it to ABC.
And astonishingly, given how out there it sounds for daytime, they actually greenlit it for production as a soap opera.
It sounds improbable, doesn't it? A dream leads to a soap about a spooky house. The initial concept was based on a story Bible written by Art Wallace, who also wrote the early episodes.
And the title wasn't even Dark Shadows at first.
No, it was proposed as Shadows on the Wall. They put together a production team, Robert Costello as producer, experienced directors like Leela Swift, John Sedgwick, Henry Kaplan. Robert Colbert did the music, which is so distinctive.
Oh, that music is unforgettable.
Right. And Cy Tomashoff did the set design. But even with all that talent, getting the show off the ground was a real struggle.
A huge struggle from what we've seen. It debuted in June 1966 and had a really, really rocky start. Those early episodes were incredibly slow-paced. They focused mostly on domestic drama, with only very subtle, almost ambiguous hints of anything supernatural.
Critics at the time apparently found it pretty boring and dull. There was one review in Variety that famously called the first episode one big contemporary yawn because Art Wallace took so long to get to the point.
Ouch. A yawn. Not what you want for a new show.
Definitely not. That slow burn, it was a real disconnect for daytime audiences who were used to, faster-paced family crises and romantic entanglements. The early storylines involved things like menacing, but unfulfilled conflicts, threats of revenge, and attempted murder, and then finally, one actual murder.
But the supernatural stuff, the things that would eventually define the show.
Introduced with agonizing slowness, you only saw really compelling evidence of a ghost in episode 52. That's nearly 3 months in. And then again around episode 70. It just wasn't giving the audience what they expected, or apparently what they wanted at first.
And the ratings reflected that.
Absolutely. In the 1965-66 television season, Dark Shadows started with a 4.1 rating. That put it 13th out of 18 daytime dramas on the air.
13th place? Not great.
Not great at all. And the next year, it barely budged, improving only slightly to a 4.3 rating.
And the daytime TV landscape was pretty cutthroat back then. Shows got canceled all the time.
It was volatile, yeah. Many shows were getting the axe. So by December 1966, just 6 months into its run, Dark Shadows was still in 13th place, but now it was 13th out of only 13 remaining soaps.
Dead last.
Head writer Sam Hall recalled this period vividly, described the show as just limping along. There was immense pressure coming down from the network.
And then came the ultimatum.
Yep. The network brass basically told Dan Curtis directly, unless you pick up in 26 weeks, you're finished. That's a countdown clock ticking right over your production.
Wow. That kind of pressure.
Yeah.
It forces you to take big swings.
It really does. And Dan Curtis, well, he'd always had this ambition to create a vampire film. So faced with the imminent cancellation of his show and with nothing else they'd tried working to boost ratings, he made a bold, maybe even desperate decision.
He decided to roll the dice.
He decided to introduce a vampire character into the series, basically a Hail Mary pass. He figured, what have we got to lose at this point? Trying something so unconventional for daytime couldn't hurt.
And that decision, born out of sheer desperation, completely changed the destiny of Dark Shadows.
It's hard to overstate how pivotal that moment was. It transformed the show, utterly.
Okay, so this is where everything shifts. The arrival of Barnabas Collins.
Yes, the iconic, the incredibly complex figure of Barnabas Collins, brought to life by the brilliant, classically trained actor Jonathan Frid.
It was amazing.
He really was. He was introduced in episode, #211 in April 1967. That was roughly 10 months into the show's run.
Though, didn't they tease his arrival?
They did. For those watching closely, his hand, reaching out from a coffin, was briefly glimpsed right at the end of the preceding episode, #210. A classic cliffhanger.
And the original plan wasn't for him to be a main character, right? It was supposed to be temporary.
That's absolutely right. The initial plan, which is pretty common in soaps to just spice things up for a bit, was for Barnabas to be a brief 13-week storyline. Just long enough to maybe generate some buzz and then, wrap it up.
But that's not what happened.
Not even close. Jonathan Frid's portrayal of Barnabas Collins just resonated with audiences in a way nobody anticipated. His popularity exploded almost immediately.
So people loved the vampire.
They loved this vampire. This sudden surge in interest, plus a time slot change to 3:3 p.m. Eastern, 2:3 Central, which was a better time for younger viewers coming home from school, exposed the show to a much larger audience.
And crucially, it attracted a demographic that maybe wasn't watching the other soaps.
Exactly. Teenagers. A huge teenage following who were perhaps bored or underserved by the traditional daytime fare. By late 1969, Dark Shadows was reaching somewhere between 7 and 9 million viewers daily.
7 to 9 million. That's huge for daytime back then.
It was massive, and it had become ABC's highest-rated daytime series. Think about that jump from dead last, facing cancellation, to the top of the network's daytime lineup in just a couple of years, largely thanks to a 175-year-old vampire.
It wasn't just more viewers, it was a different kind of viewer.
Yeah, absolutely. That large teenage following was critical. They were passionate, they talked about the show, they embraced how weird and different it was.
So with Barnabas being this huge hit, Curtis and the writers felt like they could really go for it with the Gothic stuff.
Totally. They felt empowered to lean fully into the Gothic horror that had only been hinted at before. Barnabas's immense popularity basically gave them permission.
And they didn't just lean, they plunged headfirst. It went from subtle, spooky atmosphere to embracing pretty much every supernatural element imaginable for a daytime soap.
That's almost an understatement. They introduced not just vampires, which was bold enough, but a whole pantheon of creatures and concepts. Ghosts, obviously. Werewolves, zombies, even man-made monsters like Adam and Eve.
Witches, warlocks.
Witches, warlocks, and incredibly narrative devices like time travel and even a parallel universe. This kind of expansive approach was utterly unprecedented in daytime television. It really pushed the boundaries of what a soap opera could even be.
And the show wasn't just making things up randomly, right? It drew heavily on classic literature for a lot of these storylines and characters.
Yes, that's a great point. It gave it a certain depth and resonance that was unusual for the genre. They weren't just inventing monsters out of thin air. They were borrowing heavily from Gothic and horror classics, weaving those familiar tropes into the daily drama.
Like Barnabas himself.
Well, Barnabas's introduction and his initial storyline, trying to reclaim his lost love, were clearly inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. The character of Adam, the man-made creature stitched together.
Frankenstein.
Right, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. And Victoria Winter's role as the mysterious governess arriving at the brooding mansion, plus later plot lines involving a mad woman in the attic, like Jenny Collins. That's straight out of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre.
Quentin Collins, too.
Quentin Collins had clear parallels to Peter Quint in Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. They even pulled specific plot devices from Edgar Allan Poe, elements from The Premature Burial or The Cask of Amontillado, and Oscar Wilde's. The picture of Dorian Gray definitely influenced Quentin's storyline with his portrait.
So it wasn't just throwing monsters at the wall. They were weaving them into this narrative tapestry that felt both familiar because of the soap structure and wildly imaginative because of the supernatural stuff and these literary roots.
Exactly. And speaking of weaving things together, the setting itself was absolutely crucial to this whole atmosphere. Let's talk about Collinsport, Maine, and the notorious Collinwood Mansion.
Collinsport. You can almost smell the fog and the sea salt.
It's the show's fictional, perpetually misty seaside town, somewhere along the coast of Maine. But the real heart of the show, the central location for all the drama, the intrigue, the supernatural happenings, is Collinwood Mansion.
Built in 1795 by Joshua Collins, the patriarch.
Right. And according to the lore, it wasn't just any old house. It had a reputation right from the start. Overlooking the turbulent Atlantic, it was known throughout the region for, frightening rumors and legends connected to the family's dark history.
People were actually scared of it.
Yeah, local residents were reportedly afraid to even drive by the place. That pervasive sense of dread and mystery about the house itself was so key to establishing the show's unique atmosphere.
And the mansion itself is depicted as just massive.
It's huge. Over 40 rooms, apparently, many of which are described as being closed off and unused, which just adds to that sense of decay, neglect, and secrets hidden away.
And the house itself almost felt alive sometimes, didn't it? Full of physical mysteries.
Totally. Numerous secret passageways woven throughout the walls, which were used constantly for escapes and eavesdropping. There was a stairway that, in one memorable storyline, somehow allowed characters to travel through time.
That's wild.
And even one room that was perceived differently depending on who was in it. Sometimes it looked like a playroom, other times a linen closet. Collinwood wasn't just a backdrop. It felt like an active participant in the characters' weird lives and their constant state of unrest.
But most of the action we saw daily took place in a few key areas.
Right. While the house was huge on paper, the daily drama primarily unfolded in a few instantly recognizable spots. The foyer with its grand stairway leading up, and the main drawing room. That drawing room with the imposing portrait of the ancestral Barnabas Collins hanging right by the entrance, those were central visual anchors.
But the show did take us into other parts of the mansion when the plot needed it. We saw bedrooms, like David's and Victoria's, up on the second floor.
Mm-hmm. The basement was mostly used for storage, but it got tied into the mystery surrounding Elizabeth's husband, Paul Stoddard. The study off the foyer was used for some pretty significant events, including that strange suspended animation Victoria Winters underwent.
And the West Wing room.
Uh-huh.
That was important early on, wasn't it?
Yeah, a large study cluttered with old papers. That was the site of one of the show's very first confirmed supernatural moments, when the ghost of Bill Malloy appeared to Victoria after young David locked her in there.
Creepy kid.
Definitely. Then there was the tower room, which served different ominous purposes across different time periods. It held Barnabas's coffin back in 1796 and later housed Quentin's crazed wife Jenny in the 1897 storyline.
And Quentin's own study in the West Wing, that was a whole storyline itself.
Oh, yeah, famously sealed up with Reverend Trask inside back in 1897 by Judith Collins. Then, years later, in the modern era, David and Amy Collins discovered it, finding what they thought were Quentin's skeletal remains, which led to them getting possessed by the spirits of Quentin and Beth Chavez. The house just held onto its secrets and its ghosts.
It really did. These specific rooms became characters in their own right, tied to major supernatural events.
Absolutely. Though it's worth noting, some locations you see in the later feature films, like a terrarium and a swimming pool, weren't actually part of the original TV series depiction of Collinwood's interiors.
Right. And the Collinwood estate itself was supposed to be huge, with other houses on the grounds, too.
Yes, the family had lived in other dwellings there even before the main mansion was finished. The most significant of these other locations is definitely the old house.
That was the original Collinwood, right?
Exactly. It was the first large Collins family house, known as Collinwood, before the new mansion was built. Joshua Collins had intended to give it to Barnabas as a wedding gift when he married Josette. After Barnabas's supposed death, the house was basically abandoned for decades, falling into ruin. It was only inhabited briefly in the 1890s timeline we saw.
But then Barnabas moves in when he comes back in 1967.
Right. When he was released from his tomb, he took up residence there after it was renovated. Initially, it added to his whole Gothic mystique because it had no electricity, no heat, no plumbing. He famously kept his coffin hidden down in the basement dungeon, which also conveniently concealed a secret escape passage.
And that's where Dr. Julia Hoffman set up her lab.
That's right. Julia later set up her laboratory in the old house basement, installing a generator to power her scientific experiments, including her attempts to cure Barnabas's vampirism and her creation of the man-made creature Eve,
And the portrait of Josette.
hung in the parlor. And her spirit would sometimes eerily emerge from it. Barnabas was actually still living in the old house when the series ended in 1971.
The estate and the surrounding area had other spooky spots too, like Widow's Hill.
Oh yeah, Widow's Hill, the famous cliff overlooking the ocean right next to the estate grounds, named because sailors' widows would supposedly mourn there, and haunted by their spectral forms, the Wailing Women.
That's where Josette jumped, right?
That's the place. Her tragic leap to her death to escape becoming a vampire bride. And later, Jeb Hawkes also met his end, falling from there.
And the woods on the estate grounds seemed like a bad place to wander.
Definitely not somewhere you'd want to take a midnight stroll. They were a frequent location for supernatural encounters, including near attacks by the werewolf Chris Jennings and the terrifying appearance of Judah Zachary's headless corpse stalking through the trees. Just another Tuesday in Collinsport.
Right. And there were other smaller properties mentioned too.
Yeah, like the caretaker's cottage, the coach house where Jeb Hawkes lived, the seaside shack where the Phoenix, Laura Collins, tried to immolate herself, and David and Seaview or Blair House, other unused properties on the estate with their own histories and occasional notable residents, like the demon Nicholas Blair.
It's fascinating to think how they brought this whole world to life on a, daily television budget back then.
It really is. While the interior shots for the TV series were all done on sound stages in Manhattan, sometimes famously wobbly sets.
Oh yeah, you could see the walls shake sometimes.
Exactly. But the exteriors of Collinwood were filmed at real, imposing locations. The Carey Mansion in Newport, Rhode Island was the main stand-in. The Spratt Mansion on the Lyndhurst Estate in Tarrytown, New York, and Sleepy Hollow Cemetery were also used, especially for mausoleum scenes you see in the movie.
And Collinsport itself.
Establishing shots for the town exteriors were filmed in Essex, Connecticut. That blend of real, imposing Gothic architecture for the exteriors and the atmospheric, if sometimes shaky, studio sets for the interiors really contributed to the show's unique, slightly off-kilter look and feel.
So a show with such a rich, complex setting needs a cast of equally colorful characters to inhabit it. It started, though, with a core group that kind of grounded the story in that familiar soap opera format.
Right at the beginning, yeah. The narrative was anchored by the arrival of Victoria Winters, played by Alexandra Moltke-Isle, the mysterious governess whose origins were a big early plot point. Then you had the matriarch, Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, played by the legendary film actress Joan Bennett, who was always keeping secrets.
Joan Bennett. Having her was a huge get for a daytime soap.
Absolutely. Then there was her arrogant, often dismissive brother, Roger Collins, played by the wonderfully theatrical Louis Edmonds, and Roger's troubled son, David Collins, played by David Hennessy.
Don't forget the younger generation.
Right. Also, part of that initial household was Elizabeth's restless daughter, Carolyn Stoddard, played by Nancy Barrett, and Carolyn's best friend, the working-class waitress Maggie Evans, played by Catherine Lee Scott. That was the foundation, the sort of family drama base.
And then, as the show embraced the supernatural, we got the powerhouse characters who really drove so much of the Gothic storylines, the big guns.
The figures who became the kaiju, as the blog Dark Shadows Everyday amusingly called them, because of their enormous presence and impact on the show's direction. That central trio would be, of course, Barnabas Collins the vampire, played by Jonathan Frid.
Angelique Bouchard.
The vengeful witch, played so memorably by Laura Parker. And Quentin Collins, the dashing, troubled werewolf, played by David Selby.
Quentin was huge. Didn't his theme song become a hit?
It did. David Selby's character was so popular that Robert Colbert's haunting instrumental piece, Quentin's Theme, actually became a hit song on the Billboard Hot 100. Imagine a soap opera theme cracking the pop charts today.
Crazy. But beyond that initial core in the big Supernatural 3, there were so many other memorable players who added depth and variety to these sprawling narratives.
Oh, absolutely. Grayson Hall, who was an Oscar-nominated actress known for her stage work, brought immense intelligence and gravitas to the role of Dr. Julia Hoffman, the brilliant doctor who became obsessed with Barnabas and ultimately his closest confidant.
And Willie Loomis.
John Carlin played Willie Loomis, the hapless servant who accidentally released Barnabas and then became his frazzled, often terrified human slave. He was kind of the audience's link to the mundane world reacting to all this madness.
And the villains? Reverend Trask.
Jerry Lacey was fantastic as the fanatical witch hunter Reverend Gregory Trask. He popped up in multiple time periods as this persistent antagonist against anyone dabbling in the supernatural, just relentlessly pious and cruel.
Thayer David played Professor Stokes, right? Julia's colleague.
Yes, Thayer David, with his unique voice and presence, he played Professor Stokes, an expert in the occult. The materials describe him as marbled-mouthed but meticulous and distinguished. He often provided exposition and guidance on all the weird supernatural stuff happening.
There were so many others, too. Burke Devlin, the revenge guy.
Right. Played first by Mitchell Ryan and later by Anthony George. Joe Haskell, played by Joel Crothers, Carolyn's boyfriend who went through a lot. Roger Davis played two key roles, Peter Bradford and Jeff Clark, both love interests for Victoria Winters in different timelines.
Clarice Blackburn played Mrs. Johnson, and someone else.
Yeah, she was memorable as the feisty housekeeper, Mrs. Johnson, and also the crabby ancestor, Aunt Abigail Collins, who Barnabas scared to death. Robert Rodan and Marie Wallace played the man-made monsters Adam and Eve. Don Briscoe was really effective as the tormented werewolf Chris Jennings. Diana Millay played the fiery phoenix Laura Collins.
And later on, things got even more complex with the Leviathans.
Right. In the later, very complex storylines, Christopher Pennock was memorable as the evil Leviathan leader Jeb Hawks, and James Storm played the mysterious Gerard Stiles. It was a huge cast over the years.
One of the show's really unique and kind of charming features, especially for fans who stuck with it, was the practice of cast members playing multiple roles.
Oh, yeah. That became a kind of theatrical calling card for the show, a way to utilize their talented repertory company, often not just different characters, but characters in different time periods or even in that parallel universe storyline.
Who was the first to do that?
Catherine Leigh Scott was actually the first. And according to her, it started almost by accident, a lucky fluke. She initially volunteered to stand in for a clothes dummy they were using to represent the ghost of Josette Duprez in a scene.
A dummy.
Yeah. But once Dan Curtis saw Catherine in the costume, he immediately cast her in the role, even though the network was apparently worried about confusing the audience. But the chemistry she had with Jonathan Fred as Josette was crucial for telling that 1790s backstory.
And that opened the floodgates.
Pretty much. It paved the way for nearly every other principal actor to take on multiple parts eventually. It became part of the fun, seeing who would pop up as their own ancestor or counterpart.
And looking back, the show also served as an early stepping stone for some actors who would later become really famous.
That's right. If you watch the series today, you might spot some familiar faces. Marsha Mason, who went on to become a major film star, Oscar nominee for stuff like The Goodbye Girl, she was on the show.
Harvey Keitel.
Harvey Keitel, yeah. Later a staple in Scorsese films, a major character actor. He had an early role. Conrad Bain, who everyone knows from Maude and Especially Different Strokes.
Mr. Drummond.
Mr. Drummond himself was in Dark Shadows, as was Abe Vigoda, from Barney Miller and The Godfather. And Kate Jackson, before she became one of Charlie's Angels, she appeared as Tracy Collins.
Wow. It's fun finding those connections.
It is. It's a fun little discovery for fans, seeing where some of these prominent actors got some early on-screen experience. It was this real melting pot of established talent like Joan Bennett and Grayson Hall, solid stage-trained actors handling that crazy daily production schedule, and these up-and-coming stars.
But let's circle back to the character who is arguably the most central to the show's success and its enduring appeal. Barnabas Collins. We know he's a vampire, but his story and his personality as they come across in the materials are incredibly complex, even contradictory.
Absolutely. His origin story is really the foundational myth of Dark Shadows, set back in Collinsport in 1795. Barnabas was born in 1770, the privileged son of Joshua and Naomi Collins. He was engaged to Josette Duprez, this young heiress who arrived from Martinique with her maidservant.
And that maidservant was Angelique Bouchard, who was secretly a powerful witch.
Right. And Barnabas had a brief, passionate affair with Angelique shortly after she arrived. A dalliance that would have absolutely catastrophic consequences.
Because when Josette arrived for the wedding,
Barnabas was determined to end the affair with Angelique and marry Josette, who he claimed to truly love. Angelique, of course, was spurned and furiously jealous. She used her witchcraft to manipulate Barnabas and his family, trying to force him to marry her instead.
And when Barnabas finally figured out her game, that she was a witch manipulating everything,
he confronted her and shot her. Believing she was dying, Angelique uttered this powerful curse against Barnabas, summoning a vampire bat from hell to attack him as her final act of revenge.
So the bite came after he shot her.
Yes. Barnabas fell gravely ill, appeared to die, but shortly after, he rose from his coffin, transformed into a vampire.
And the first thing he does...
His very first act upon rising was to go back to Angelique's side and strangle her. Ironically, it turned out she hadn't actually died from the gunshot wound, but she seemed to truly die from his vampiric attack. But the curse was already in place, sealing his fate.
And his transformation brought just devastation to his family.
Unspeakable tragedy. His mere appearance and his monstrous form literally frightened his elderly Aunt Abigail to death. His younger sister, Sarah Collins, who he adored, was terrified of what he'd become, hid from him in the cold woods, and died of pneumonia.
And his mother?
His mother, Naomi, discovered his secret and, unable to bear the horror, committed suicide.
And Josette, the woman he claimed to love.
She ultimately leapt to her death from Widow's Hill. This tragic act happened after Angelique showed her this terrifying vision of what she would become if Barnabas succeeded in turning her into a vampire bride, which he was actively trying to do.
So Barnabas blamed Angelique for a lot of this.
He did. He blamed her for the deaths of Sarah and Naomi, and he also murdered Lieutenant Nathan Forbes, who had revealed his secret to Naomi. He was leaving a trail of bodies.
So, haunted by all this destruction, he asked his father to kill him.
Yes, in a rare moment of lucidity and despair, he begged his father, Joshua, to destroy him. But Joshua, despite the horror, just couldn't bring himself to kill his own son. Instead, he ordered his loyal servant, Ben Stokes, to nail a cross to the inside of Barnabas's coffin and wrap heavy chains around it.
Imprisoning him.
Effectively imprisoning the vampire in a secret, locked room within the family mausoleum at Eagles Hill Cemetery.
And there he stayed for nearly 200 years.
Until 1967, when poor Willie Loomis, foolishly searching the mausoleum for the legendary Collins family jewels, stumbled upon the chained coffin and inadvertently broke the chains, releasing him. Willie became his first victim in the modern era.
So Barnabas attacks Willie, turns him into his servant.
His unwilling, often terrified human slave, yeah. Barnabas then insinuated himself into the modern Collins family's lives, claiming to be a cousin from England, using his uncanny resemblance to that ancestral portrait hanging in Collinwood to gain their trust, or at least their acceptance.
But he needed blood, which led him to Maggie Evans.
Right. His vampiric nature required fresh blood, and he quickly became obsessed with Maggie, the waitress from the local diner, because she looked so much like his long-lost love, Josette.
So he kidnaps her?
Kidnapped her, hypnotized her, desperately tried to force her to believe she was Josette, and planned to turn her into his vampire bride. Classic vampire stuff, but on a daily soap.
How did she escape?
She eventually managed to escape, partly with some unexpected help from the ghost of Sarah Collins, Barnabas's little sister. Her ghost appeared to both Maggie and Barnabas, tormenting Barnabas with guilt over her death and repeatedly warning him against his evil deeds.
So after Maggie gets away, he shifts his focus.
He does. After Maggie's escape and her recovery from the trauma, though she never fully remembered it all, Barnabas then set his sights on the mysterious governess, Victoria Winters. He became infatuated with her, trying to seduce her and ultimately turn her as well.
And this is where Dr. Julia Hoffman comes in.
Exactly. This dangerous pursuit of Victoria indirectly led to the introduction of Dr. Julia Hoffman, who will become one of the most significant characters in the entire show. Julia was initially brought in to help Maggie at Wincliffe Sanitarium, where Maggie was recovering. Through her investigations into Maggie's strange condition, Julia discovered the terrifying truth about Barnabas Collins.
And Julia wasn't just scared.
No, Dr. Hoffman, played with such intelligence and nuance by Grayson Hall, was a brilliant medical researcher. She reacted not just with fear, but with scientific fascination and eventually this deep, unrequited love for Barnabas.
She tried to cure him.
Yes. She attempted to cure his vampirism through a series of complex medical experiments in her basement laboratory at the old house. She also used hypnosis to help Maggie forget the trauma of her kidnapping, though Maggie never fully regained all those memories.
How did Barnabas react to Julia finding out his secret?
Initially, with profound distrust and hostility. When her early attempts to cure him failed and she knew what he was, he saw her as a massive threat who could expose him. He actually made several attempts to either kill her or drive her mad to silence her.
But that changed dramatically.
It really did. Their dynamic gradually evolved into something incredibly complex and just captivating for the audience. While the romantic relationship Julia clearly desired never really materialized on screen in a conventional way, they became uneasy allies, then deep friends, and eventually an almost inseparable pair.
He became protective of her.
Incredibly protective. The sources describe him going to extraordinary lengths to protect Julia from enemies, whether they were other supernatural beings like Angelique, vengeful ghosts, or even those cosmic forces like the Leviathans later on.
There's a moment mentioned where he admits he cares about her.
Yeah, there's a moment described where Barnabas admits to Willie Loomis, sort of quietly, that he cares for Julia more than he appears to. And in one really pivotal storyline, he was completely under the control of the evil Leviathans, obeying their every command.
But he couldn't kill her.
The only thing that allowed him to break free of their influence was their direct order to kill Julia. He just couldn't do it. He even fiercely warned Angelique in one confrontation never to try and harm Julia again, showing how deep his protective feelings ran.
This relationship with Julia really highlights that complex duality of Barnabas, doesn't it? Which is probably key to why people found him so compelling.
Absolutely. He often rationalized his cruel actions, his vampiric nature, by blaming it on being undead, on being Nosferatu, cursed to kill. It wasn't his fault, it was the curse.
But the materials and the show's own history for the character reveal instances of his cruelty and impulsiveness that existed before he was ever bitten by that vampire bat.
Exactly. That's the really fascinating part. His secretive affair with Angelique while claiming to love Josette, that was the betrayal that set the whole tragedy in motion. He fatally wounded his own uncle, Jeremiah Collins, in a duel fought over Josette that was born of jealousy and wounded pride, not vampirism.
He tried to back out of marrying Angelique.
Yeah, even after she had seemingly saved his sister Sarah's life through her magic. And most damningly, he attempted to murder Angelique when he discovered she was a witch before she cursed him. And he even tried to kill his own father, Joshua, when Joshua tried to contain him right after his transformation.
Wow. So the darkness was already there.
It seems so. There are powerful quotes from the show that emphasize this. Ben Stokes, the loyal servant who helped imprison Barnabas, said he weren't no good then, neither, but now he's worse.
And his father.
Joshua Collins himself, horrified when Barnabas tried to kill him, exclaimed, "You would kill even me. You must have always had so much hatred in you. No one could be filled with it so quickly." It paints this picture of a man who perhaps already harbored a significant darkness, which the curse only amplified and twisted into something truly monstrous.
Jonathan Frid understood this complexity too.
Reportedly, yes. Fred himself apparently understood this, noting that the character's success was partly due to the lies he told to himself about why he did the things he did. But despite the monstrous acts in Frid's portrayal, Barnabas also showed moments of genuine conscience, guilt, and the capacity for deep feeling and connection, especially with Julia. He wasn't a simple villain at all.
Which is quite different from how he's been portrayed in some of the later Dark Shadows adaptations.
That's a key distinction, yeah. In the 1970 feature film House of Dark Shadows, Barnabas, also played by Frid, was presented as much more of a traditional, purely evil vampire. He killed a lot of family members in that version and was ultimately destroyed, much less conflicted.
And then there's the Tim Burton movie with Johnny Depp.
Right, the 2012 film. That version took a much more comedic, kind of eccentric approach. It presented a somewhat modernized Barnabas who, while still deeply obsessed with Josette, manifested through Victoria in that version, also developed this genuine, almost childlike love for his modern family descendants.
And his relationship with Julia was totally different.
Completely different. She was never his confidant or ally in that version. She was trying to exploit him. Depp's Barnabas was more pop culture savvy, discovering rock music, dressing in more colorful, though still gothic clothes. A very different take from Frid's more somber, tormented portrayal.
So while Barnabas is undeniably central, the show's enduring appeal clearly goes beyond just one character, no matter how iconic and complex he is. What was it about the show as a whole that captured audiences' imagination so strongly and turned it into this lasting cult classic?
Well, several factors really converged. As actor David Selby, who played Quentin, put it quite nicely, the show succeeded by creating its own little world and how whatever occurred in that world made sense in that world.
Right, consistency within its own crazy rules.
Exactly. This self-contained, consistent reality, no matter how outlandish it got, fostered a strong sense of intimacy and immersion for the viewers. You accepted the ghosts and the time travel because it felt internally logical within Collinsport.
Plus, it just had such a distinctive style.
Undeniably. The heightened, almost theatrical, melodramatic performances, the deliberately atmospheric interiors, even with the occasional wobbly set, the constant, often shocking, dramatic plot twists that kept viewers hooked day after day, and that broad cosmos of interconnected characters across time and dimensions, it was like nothing else.
And the actors were mostly stage trained, right? Which must have helped with the daily grind.
Absolutely. Many of the principal cast members had extensive stage training, which was invaluable for the demands of daily live-to-tape television production. They could handle the long scenes, the rapid memorization of lines, and bring a certain truth and integrity to even the most bizarre storylines.
Catherine Lee Scott mentioned it just being a good story.
Yeah, she mentioned the importance of it being fundamentally a good story well told, and the deep connection audiences felt with the characters' flaws and all. You cared about these people, even the monstrous ones sometimes.
And behind it all, Dan Curtis.
Definitely. As David Selby noted, Dan Curtis was the heart and soul of the show. There truly would have been no Dark Shadows without his singular vision and his willingness to take those huge risks, like introducing Barnabas.
And you can't forget the fans.
Critically important. The show wouldn't have survived its early struggles or developed the passionate, long-lasting legacy it has without the dedication of its fans. They were incredibly loyal, writing letters, forming fan clubs, organizing conventions later on, and just keeping the flame alive long after the original run ended.
That fan dedication must have played a huge role in making sure the show itself survived, physically. It's pretty remarkable that all 12,225 episodes of the original series were preserved in some form, right? That was rare for soaps back then.
It is highly unusual. While some might only exist now as black and white kinescopes, basically film recordings made directly off a TV monitor, or even just as audio recordings for a few missing ones, the vast majority are available. This preservation meant that the show could be rediscovered by new generations.
Which led to home video releases.
Exactly. You could get it on VHS back in the day. Then came the comprehensive DVD collections, including that unique coffin-shaped complete series set that's become such a collector's item.
And now, thankfully, you can stream it pretty easily.
Yeah, it's available on various streaming platforms like Pluto TV, Tubi, Amazon Prime, and MPI's own service. It's easily accessible for anyone curious to dive into its world today.
And the Dark Shadows universe kept expanding even after the show ended. There were the movies.
Right, the two feature films produced during the original run, House of Dark Shadows in 1970 and Night of Dark Shadows in 1971. Actors were actually temporarily written out of the TV series storyline so they could go film these movies.
And the second movie focused on Quentin.
Yeah, Night of Dark Shadows notably shifted its focus to Quentin Collins rather than Barnabas, partly because Jonathan Fred was apparently reluctant to be typecast forever as the vampire.
And there are all the books.
Oh, a long history of spin-off novels. The prolific Marilyn Ross wrote a staggering 32 paperback books based on the show during its original run. Some of those even explored alternate timelines, like what if Barnabas wasn't imprisoned for centuries?
And original cast members wrote some later.
Yeah, later on, original cast members like Lara Parker, Angelique, wrote new novels continuing the saga, adding to the lore.
Plus comics, magazines.
The franchise extended into other media, too. Comic books, magazines featuring interviews with the cast and behind-the-scenes insights thanks to dedicated fans and journalists like Rod Labb, who kept documenting it, and various merchandise that tapped into the show's popularity, especially among young people back then. Cards, games, that sort of thing.
And the world of Call-in-Sport continues even today through audio dramas.
That's right, notably through audio dramas. There was a play recorded for MPI, the company that distributes the show, called Return to Collinwood. But the really extensive continuation is the ongoing series from Big Finish Productions.
They do a lot of Doctor Who audios, right?
Exactly. They're well known for creating licensed audio fiction. And their Dark Shadows audios are remarkable because they feature many of the original cast members reprising their roles. David Selby as Quentin, Lara Parker as Angelique, Catherine Lee Scott in various roles.
Who plays Barnabas in those?
Andrew Collins voices Barnabas in the main ongoing series. But, incredibly, Jonathan Fred himself returned to portray Barnabas one last time in the 2010 audio drama The Night Whispers. A really touching final performance before he passed away.
Wow. That continuous life in all these different forms really speaks volumes about the show's cultural impact and its legacy.
It truly does. Dark Shadows is credited with being the first, and arguably still the most successful, attempt to introduce gothic horror themes, vampires, werewolves, witches, ghosts into the normally very domestic world of daytime soap operas.
It really changed the game.
It did. Its unique blend of supernatural elements and daily melodrama cemented its status as a genuine cult television phenomenon. It brought monster culture, which was huge in the 1960s, with monster movies and magazines right into people's homes every afternoon.
And scholars have looked at it too.
Yeah, people have analyzed its significance, pointing to its intricate world building and serialized nature as potentially influencing later genre television shows that built complex, ongoing mythologies like Buffy or The X-Files.
And the themes it explored.
Some interpretations view the show's blending of horror and melodrama as a kind of reflection or metaphor for Cold War-era social anxieties and the rapid cultural shifts happening in the 1960s. It also definitely delved into deep psychological themes, identity, trauma, repression, guilt, particularly through Barnabas and his constant struggle with his nature in his past.
Given how popular and influential it was, it's not surprising there have been several attempts over the years to revive or reboot Dark Shadows for new audiences.
Yes, quite a few tries. The most notable was probably that lavish, big-budget, primetime remake that aired on NBC back in 1991.
I remember that one. Ben Cross played Barnabas.
That's the one. It starred Ben Cross as Barnabas and had prominent actors like Gene Simmons as Elizabeth and even a very young Joseph Gordon-Levitt as David. But it was pretty short-lived. It struggled in the ratings and, unfortunately, got frequently preempted or rescheduled because of news coverage of the first Gulf War. Bad timing.
Then there was another attempt later.
There was an unaired pilot made for the WB network back in 2004 with an actor named Alec Newman taking on the role of Barnabas. But it never went to series.
And then, much more recently, the Tim Burton movie.
Right, the 2012 feature film directed by Tim Burton starring Johnny Depp. As we discussed, that version leaned heavily into comedy and eccentricity. It wasn't a major box office success, though Eva Green's performance as Angelique got a lot of praise.
And wasn't there talk of a TV continuation more recently?
There was. A proposed continuation for the CW network, titled Dark Shadows: Reincarnation. It was reported to be in development for a while, but updates since late 2020 suggest it might have stalled, or perhaps it's being retooled. It's hard to recapture that original magic.
Still, the show's influence pops up in unexpected places.
It does. The General Hospital spinoff Port Charles introduced a vampire storyline back in 2000, which was a pretty bold move for a mainstream soap. Dark Shadows arguably paved the way for something like that decades earlier.
Dark Shadows truly carved out its own completely unique niche in television history. A show that just defied easy categorization and clearly continues to fascinate viewers today.
It certainly did. A one-off, really.
So here's maybe something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. Dark Shadows somehow managed to make a show about vampires, witches, and ghosts work as a daily soap opera, right alongside the familiar stuff like family secrets, forbidden love, inheritance battles. What does it say about us, the audience, that we found such compelling resonant drama not just in those domestic struggles, but in the explicitly supernatural terrors living right alongside them in Collinwood?
That's a great question. It tapped into something about our appetite for both the mundane and the mysterious, didn't it?
Yeah, maybe suggesting they're not so separate after all. Our daily lives and our deepest fears and fantasies all mixed up together.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it, that our daily lives and our deepest fears could coexist so seamlessly in this misty, strange little fictional town called Collinsport.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Dark Shadows. What a truly singular and influential piece of television history.
We hope you learned something new about this gothic cult classic and maybe feel inspired to visit the eerie world of Collinsport yourself through streaming or DVD.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. If you enjoyed exploring the shadows with us today, please be sure to like, subscribe, and hey, leave a comment. Let us know what classic soap opera you'd like us to dive into next time.